So we are joined by our real political insider, the man who's there in the big house down in the Cape, the big tent. Not a house, it's a tent. And that is Mmusi Maimane. Welcome to the Political Insider.
The informal settlement of Parliament.
Yeah, we eventually Africanized even Parliament, right? No, this Parliament is quite a camp. Yeah.
That's another statement that I will let go, but I'm not sure. Yeah, let's keep going.
Okay, let's talk about some of the happenings, because it's been a little while since we've had the pleasure of your company. The Madlanga Commission has been going, and it's now 2 weeks on. It's been quite interesting, I think, for the people on the inside. Something struck me about the Madlanga Commission. It's the first commission, as I see it, where the pressure came from within to have a commission rather than outside. All the other commissions followed books and exposés and Sunday Times lead articles and that. This is the first time that we've got a public servant action where the government responded to something within. And that sort of changes the game somewhat.
Firstly, I think it's profound courage on General Mkhwanazi for us to arrive at this point. To your point, I mean, I can remember the amount of pressure I put on President Zuma to make sure that the first state capture commission comes through. You'll remember it was really born out of the fact that I asked him questions about the Guptas and many other that. It was under profound pressure that even for President Ramaphosa to ask him about a number of issues around, that whole state capture need, him having to appear. That's an important thing. I agree with you that I think General Mkhwanazi took a very courageous stance. He took and ultimately, what's going to be important is a commission of inquiry is but one thing. The prosecutorial work must be another and must continue. But the long-term issue is that it is starting to speak a lot more of the things that we know, which to some ways it's been interesting, yet it's been boring, because we know that the ANC set out to capture the state. We know that decisions that are made sometimes put pressure on bureaucrats, who some of them are trying to do a decent day's job, to respond politically rather than principally or legally. We know these things because we see them. So General Mkhwanazi was a public whistleblower, and I think what needs to be honored post this is that the treatment he gets should be afforded, whether in confidence, by legislation that protects the many civil servants, who some of them have spoken out about these issues and ended up in a coffin.
Yeah, and as I said, the interesting thing is how many more Mkhwanazis are out there.
Correct.
He was in a perfect position where he had enough status, self-esteem, etc., that he could do what he did. Babita Diakaran couldn't. So she ends up, getting gunned down. One of the key thing, as you say, part of it has been boring and procedural, but there's clearly a new wind out there, a new way of thinking, and all roads seem to lead upstairs. That's been the interesting thing, has been to me that the questions, the people that need to answer the questions, Senzo Mchunu, Bheki Cele, and the President. Will they be called to the Commission, in your opinion?
Well, certainly, I think all of them must come and appear before the Commission. It would do the Commission an injustice. Firstly, that South Africans, it would be a dereliction of duty that the actions of a particular department, certainly on political killings, an issue so central to governance, that the President would be ignorant of that fact. I think it would be a profound dereliction of duty. And this time around, the thing I'm looking forward to is that President Ramaphosa in the State Capture Commission was able to say, President Zuma knew these things. Today he is the president. And therefore the excuse does not hold that he was deputy, and therefore now he should know. And if he didn't know, there are bigger questions to ask, that there could be decisions of this monumental importance and the President of the Republic did not know. The second is, I think it gives him and Bheki Cele and Senzo Mchunu to come and clear their names. And it begs the bigger question, which is, what happens to the report post facto? Should there be, once President Ramaphosa appears, does he then by implication mean that he's unfit to be able to be the first recipient of the report, even though he is originator of the commission, does that mean that there needs to be Parliament through an independent body that is able to process that so that accountability is done? And if the president in any way has got implications on that issue, then the president must also be held to account. So I think where it's setting up is going to be that fundamental question, which is to say, if the president is found to no longer be the referee of the commission, but an actual player, let's appoint a competent referee to be able to deal with the consequences of that. Otherwise, we're going to repeat the same movie as the State Capture Commission or any other commission that has happened, in that it hands back the report to what I've really come to understand, and I want to quote the president at the State Capture report, when he said the ANC is accused number one. I would argue the common thread here is that all of them are ANC ministers and ANC leaders in this sense.
And of course, the one major difference is that when all of those other commissions of inquiry reports landed on the president's desk, they had a majority and a way of kind of like sweeping it under the carpet. I think that if the GNU tries to sweep it under the carpet, I'd be most surprised.
I would hope so. And that's why I'm saying, who is going to be the independent referee? And I think the Speaker of the National Assembly is going to have a tough job on their hands, because once it leaves the president's desk, it arrives at the Speaker's desk. And South Africa is not short of reports. This is the pain. Where South Africa is short of is consequence and accountability. And for me, politicians are living in a consequence-free universe, and they are protected. The only fear they hold is publicity or negative publicity, is the fact that the media will report on these issues. But they don't fear prosecution. They don't fear jail time. And the sooner we get around to that, it's the sooner we begin the fight against corruption. So to me, whilst I know many people say, where are the orange overalls? Yes, the campaign is correct, because all it's asking is that in the name of Babita, in the name of Mkhwanazi, in the name of so many others, surely they can't feel the repercussions, and the actual protagonists aren't feeling the consequences. So to me, the work that we've got to do is make sure that this commission has consequence. That's why I've called for a prosecutorial journey parallel to that, because in the absence of that, it becomes a report that still has to be followed up. Then people use state resources to fight the same findings, because then they challenge them in judicial processes. And then we never get down to the fact that someone who has interfered or delayed the means of justice should end up in jail. And I think, honestly, my hope for this country is that the sooner we get a non-ANC president, not because of a hatred to the ANC, but fundamentally because we need to unhinge ourselves of some of the thinking that sits within the ANC, and unhinge ourselves from the idea that the state is an expansion of the ANC, so that we make decisions that are in the interest of the state rather than in the interest of the party.
Mmusi, just for point of clarity, explain to us now what happens to the ad hoc committee. This one that was called up, correct, where Soviet Lechanyane kicked for touch. Julius Malema helped him to not have this thing go ahead. We don't know what the status is. They spent 10 hours asking what they're going to talk about, and nothing seems to have happened. Is this process going to happen, or has it been, is it now stillborn?
It has to, because it was voted on by Parliament. And therefore, the Speaker of the National Assembly will expect a report that comes from that. Now, that report that comes from that committee and the calling of witnesses, etc., Parliament must utilize its full powers to be able to achieve that. And I think some of it could not just be a matter of kicking for touch, but ministers, political appointees account to Parliament. And so if the president is found on this issue, I would argue that that could be a basis upon a report being used to whether push for confidence or no confidence in the president. So I don't think it should be a light matter. It's a very important matter. And the president has every right to come and defend themselves and respond on this issue. But it cannot be such that the institution of Parliament becomes a lapdog of the executive and fail to do what South Africans ask of it to do, which is to hold political principles accountable. The other difficult issues, and that's why sometimes, even in talking about commissions, etc., South Africa kind of stumbles from one commission to the next, to the next, to the next, because we don't use the existing legislation. So much so that we need to always be running extra investigations. In this particular instance, it's not rocket science. The president is empowered by law to be able to dismiss one minister and find another. The first action should have been to relieve Mr. Mchunu of his duties as police commissioner. Can't put him on special leave and create a ghost worker. Appoint, and I always maintain that the best minister of police is the best policeman. Appoint within the police the best policeman, so that we can stabilize that institution. Because all that's happening now is that the entrails of the police are being laid out in front of the public. And I'm not sure that helps build morale and confidence in the police. So you need the best policeman to be able to be minister, lead that process. And on another day, the day will come, we have our own power to be able to say the best commissioner of police must be voted on. I've been traveling all over the world, and I'm realizing how, because the judiciary, or at least that work of criminal prosecution, is so crucial, that the people who are tasked with the duty to do it must be impartial, be able to stand independently, so that they're not, if you like, interfered on by what politicians do. And so in part, I would argue that there is an argument to be made that the police commissioner must be someone who is voted on, or someone who derives their mandate from the public, not from the president.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned you've been traveling.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason, ladies and gentlemen, why he's been a little bit scarce. Yeah. Tell us about those travels, and what are the lessons that you picked up that are, could be applied in South Africa?
Yeah, I've been in Asia, so I've been in Malaysia and Singapore. And I think once you enter the global space, you begin to think hard about where does South Africa, Africa fit within that context. And so, having spent time, there are some key issues that I think South Africa is being left behind on. We may be sitting here debating our own commissions, but the main genuine crisis that South Africa faces is poor economic growth. It is what President Clinton put so eloquently. It is about jobs, stupid. Forget everything else. Talk about economic growth, because when people prosper, peace is within the land. So my experience of traveling of both those countries is that, one, you need a couple of things to happen. The first is you need a regulatory framework that makes investment possible. I know others might have drawn conclusions in looking at a country like Singapore about the legacies of colonialism, etc. I think that's a bad conclusion. I think the main conclusion to draw is the fact that Singapore was built on profound leadership, strong leadership that was able to ensure that it drove that country towards a couple of things. One, how do you build an asset in your people? Realizing you don't have minerals, you don't have any of that. The people are the asset. Secondly, how do you make yourself a jurisdiction upon which investment can flow? So things like corporate tax rates. Singapore, I think, is just below 9%. I would argue South Africa must think hard. We can make this an ideological issue until the cows come home. But we are taxing corporates at 28%. I would argue the global ceiling, not floor, is being set at 15. We need to follow suit. Otherwise, investment and global investment is not going to flow into South Africa. So we need to really commit ourselves to a 15% tax rate. We need to capacitate the state. If you really believe in the state, as many parties do, if you really believe in the state, so forget about debating its size, rather debate its competence. And I would argue our state in certain instances is incapable. My wife was traveling with me. She got onto a coach where it was a woman-only coach, because they're trying to respond to crime against women, religious sensitivities, and many other issues in Malaysia. And it blew me away, because this was a government who said, this is an issue, here's how we respond, and here's how we use our public transport. I am not sure we have a government, let alone a parliament, who's able to at times look at issues that South Africans are going through and say, let's begin to test out solutions and see whether they work. Instead, we have a government that is committed to not learning or unlearning certain things. The last thing I would say is that if you want to attract investment, of course, tax is but one. Of course, regulation is another. Of course, you've got to ensure that the idea of the identity of the South African, or the citizen is important. Malaysians are Malaysians. Singaporeans are Singaporeans, regardless of whether they may be of Indian, Chinese descent or Malay descent. They are Singaporeans, and we need to bring that back into our country so that we understand that we act as a state in order to respond to other things, and then be aggressive at building infrastructure that enables growth. Public transport, for argument's sake, is a fundamental in developing cities. And I think here in South Africa, that might be a game changer in us being able to make sure not only do we build integrated societies, but we make sure that our public investment is focused in the right direction. So to me, I come back inspired by great leadership, great institutions, great education programs to be able to deliver global relevance, rather than sometimes when you come and listen to some of our South African politics and you feel like we're still debating things. People are talking AI, and I feel like we're still talking VHS.
Yeah.
It's
Now, of course, Malaysia is quite an interesting one, especially in the South African context, because it is quite a diverse country. They did go down the road of looking backwards to no development. You know, some of their policies, they have struggled. They've had all sorts of problems. What should be the lesson that should Malaysia be a big beacon for South Africa?
Well, there's some lessons to learn there. Like, even though there's complexity in their politics, and Malaysia's fought corruption, it could also be caught up in many inquiries, commissions, etc. The one thing I remember, the first time I went to Malaysia was maybe about just 8, 9 years ago. And they were the first to build a smart city. Why? Because when your bureaucracy is competent, even though there may be political headwinds, the bureaucracy runs the thing through. And the bureaucracy is obligated to deliver regardless of the diversity. The Chinese community there is there. They've had to think about how to empower. But the fact of the matter is that their bureaucracy has been able to say, here's how we go. Now, of course, the examples don't always match up. They've got a monarch, all of those things. But the fact is, now that smart city, if you go to it, you can see the fact that there are people living there, they are thriving, they're becoming a global city. They have interconnectedness in terms of public transport, building bullet trains. They've shown how that is. But the fourth thing that happens around those particular countries is that they've built a network called ASEAN, which then incorporates some of the some of the countries. And in fact, Malaysia happened to be hosting it now. But the power is that they're able to negotiate as a bigger bloc against China, where it sits. But furthermore, they're able to demonstrate economic growth as a collective. So they include Thailand, South Korea, many other parts. So what does it mean for us? We must not only think just parochially as South Africans, but wouldn't it be amazing if we thought about countries who share our own developmental space, our size of GDP? We said, let's create a unit here so that we negotiate better for better trade relations, for bigger market share, for intra-trade amongst ourselves. These are big opportunities. If I make jeans here, let's assume there's a child who makes jeans in Soweto. May that child be able to sell the same jeans in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, etc. But it's not just being said. It's about building infrastructure that makes sure those goods can arrive. There's a custom system that allows an exchange of goods. And then we can build bigger markets, and we can improve growth. My pain, Mike, as I come back, is that we can have debates about yesterday, and yesterday is a feature of today. But we have to be thinking about tomorrow, because what Lee Kuan Yew produced was he saw Singapore as it is today before it was, and worked like hell to get there. Thought through, if today now we talk about AI, I don't hear conversations in South Africa too much about AI and how it can make even the work of government easier. How do we digitize the state to make sure ease of doing business is much more achieved? How do we move poor people to the middle class? I just get the impression that our discussions are stale. They are just almost, if you like, we've become so corruption, because corruption is such a big issue. And I'm not saying we must just dismiss it, but are we obsessed enough about development of the future of this country? And I don't think we are.
Yeah. And one last thing that must be said about Malaysia is that their former president did go to jail.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, for corruption.
Exactly.
And that was quite a big move when they finally acted against a corrupt president who did no worse than his predecessors, but he did end up in jail.
And that's what you know, that there's a centrality of the rule of law, is that it's applicable to everybody. And everybody can feel it. Because once you have that, you can police other crimes by letting people experience the fear of consequence. The problem with South Africa is that if you don't see anyone go to jail publicly or on television, you also believe that, well, if I skip a red robot, it's okay.
Yeah.
No one's going to catch me. And all of these issues.
And it's all it's going to cost me is a streetwise too. Which leads us to the very last point, and that is and I know that because of you've done some international travel, we're about to host the G20. They're going to see us potholes and all. But what happens then is a question you put to me. What have we even thought about? What happens after that?
Countries that have hosted the G20, many of them, India was probably one of the few who at their chairmanship said, what are the things that advance India that we need to put on the agenda, agree on, and we go? And the reality of it is that India's GDP post facto has been growing at about 4%. They are a leading light as far as countries that are starting to show growth, development. You can debate Narendra Modi, you can debate what the policies is, you can debate all of that. But the reality of it is that the proof is in the economic pudding, and the reality is that it is growing. And today we don't talk about IT, we talk about Indian technology. Yeah. South Africa, 1st of December arrives, we hand over to the United States. Surely we can't then say we are proud of ourselves for having hosted successful events. I certainly think we'll succeed at that. But when you look at the objectives, sustainability, quality, etc., what have those meant in the global G20 summit? I wish maybe one of the things that we could talk about is debt rationalization for developing economies. Because in truth, even if you strip away corruption, you strip away all of those things, countries become stuck at debt servicing and they're incapable of investment. Now you might say, of course they borrowed and all of that. The US borrowing levels are higher. They got a $3 trillion debt bill, and that's what President Trump's headache is at the moment. For South Africa, we know that 22% of our budget is spent on debt servicing cost. Could it be that at least at one level, given that, sure, some of our debt is held in rand, some of it is held in international markets, we could find a way of reducing debt so that countries are able to invest? When we think about things like even climate agreements, yes, I agree, we need to put mitigation on the table. But that mitigation cannot come at the fact that, you can't build your own power plants, whatever those power plants are. So South Africa is now living in this agreement where effectively you will receive money from G20 countries who are making contributions to ease our conscience. Here's money to South Africa. Stop your coal plants, etc., etc. Fair enough. But you cannot hamstring us from being able to build our energy capability, because that hamstrings our economy. And the cost, the money we receive relative to the money we could receive if we had our own energy being building furthermore, are in different quantums. So I really do think, whilst I'm not one of those who says South Africa for South Africa only, I'm also conscious that there must be priorities that guide what we seek to achieve as a country post the G20. And I would argue it's a response on climate to say we want to have the capability to build more energy and capability so that we can export energy to developing countries. We need to think hard about, so that's in response to the question of sustainability, etc. But on the issue of equality, we need to have a better conversation about debt, because that will help us finance things better. Otherwise, it's just vibes, as young people say. Yeah,
and it's all meaningless if we don't have economic growth, because economic growth creates jobs. The reason that the US has got the debt crisis it has is because they've got a flourishing economy and people are happy to lend them money or take their debt in dollars. The one goes with the other. It's like a rich guy who has a bigger limit on his credit card because they see him as being able to pay.
And that's the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is sometimes debt to GDP can become an obsessed number, but the other truth behind it is that your ability to service your costs is vital. So to your point, it's absolutely correct what you're saying. If we create the capability to pay more debt, we can get more debt. But what I'm trying to caution us against is to say, let's not borrow for day-to-day living. Let's borrow to invest. And certainly, whatever happens to this new PIC board, and that's another issue I know we'll touch about on another stage, but whatever that board's mandate is, it must not be to give government cheap money. It must rather be invest in sustainable infrastructure. That must be the focus. And ultimately, the reason we should ask better questions about how that board was appointed is because they sit on 3 trillion rands worth of assets under management, and they best be able to take yours and citizens' pension and use it for their investment for their kids' future.
Mmusi, thank you so much for joining us. Let's not forget that South Africa is incapable of growing our economy because we don't have the electricity after all these years, and there's no plan to increase our electricity. So we can stop right there because it's all just sort of semantics from there on. But thank you to Mmusi Maimane, our political insider. Thank you for joining us. Subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much. We'll see you again on the Political Insider.